Hey there, welcome back to the channel. I'll be finishing my series in the motion regarding presidential immunity and whether the former president qualifies for it for his efforts in changing the results of the 2020 election. And again, as a reminder, this is read from the legal perspective of Special Prosecutor Jack Smith as he filed it to the court on October 2nd. So please feel free to share or clip any portion of this or any other video on the channel. And if you do clip it for your use, all I ask is a channel mention, and thank you so much. Everyone else, please like the video and subscribe if you like the content. And back to what we're doing at hand. This video covers the events that occurred on January 6th. So let's get started. F. The defendant caused unlawful conduct on January 6th and tried to take advantage of the riot that ensued. The defendant's continued intense pressure campaign against the vice president ran into the early morning hours of January 6th. Around 1 a.m., the defendant tweeted falsely, "If Vice President Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Many states want to decertify the mistake they made in certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in a process not approved by their state legislatures, which it must be. Mike can send it back." At 8:17 a.m., as the supporters he had summoned to the city gathered near the White House, the defendant again falsely tweeted about the certification the following: "States want to correct their votes, which they know were based on irregularities and fraud. Plus, corrupt process never received legislative approval. All Mike Pence can do is send them back to the states, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage." Later that morning, CC5 worked with another attorney for the defendant, who contacted a U.S. senator to ask him to obtain the fraudulent Wisconsin and Michigan documents from the U.S. Representative's office and hand them to the vice president. When one of the U.S. senator's staffers contacted a Pence staffer by text message to arrange the delivery of what the U.S. senator staffer had been told were alternate slates of electors for Michigan and Wisconsin because the archivist didn't receive them, Pence's staffer rejected them. At 11:15 a.m., shortly before traveling to the Ellipse to speak to his supporters, the defendant called Pence and made one last attempt to induce him to act unlawfully in the upcoming session. When Pence again refused, he told the defendant that he intended to make a statement to Congress before the certification proceeding confirming that he lacked the authority to do what the defendant wanted. The defendant was incensed. He decided to reinsert into his campaign speech at the Ellipse remarks regarding Pence for his refusal to misuse his role in the certification. And the defendant set into motion the last plan in furtherance of his conspiracies. If Pence would not do what he asked, the defendant needed to find another way to prevent the certification of Biden as president. So, on January 6th, the defendant sent to the Capitol a crowd of angry supporters, whom the defendant had called to the city, and inundated with false claims of outcome-determinative election fraud to induce Pence not to certify the legitimate electoral votes and to obstruct the certification. At the Ellipse campaign rally, CC1 and CC2 spoke just before the defendant. In his rally speech, CC1 sought to cloak the conspiracies in an air of legitimacy, assuring the defendant's supporters that, quote, "Every single thing that has been outlined as the plan for today is perfectly legal." And then he also introduced preeminent constitutional scholar, unquote, who would further explain his plan. He falsely claimed that legislatures in 5 states were begging to have their electoral ballots returned. CC1 then asserted that Pence could decide on the validity of these crooked ballots and told the crowd, quote, "Let's have trial by combat," unquote. CC2, in his speech, claimed that Pence must send electoral votes to the state legislatures, quote, "for the American people to know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not." He also decried "We no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get the answer to this question," unquote. When the defendant took the stage at the Ellipse rally to speak to the supporters who had gathered there at his urging, he knew that Pence had refused, once and for all, to use the defendant's fraudulent elector certificates. The defendant also knew that he only had one last hope to prevent Biden's certification as president: the large and angry crowd standing in front of him. So for more than an hour, the defendant delivered a speech designed to inflame his supporters and motivate them to march into the Capitol. The defendant told his crowd many of the same lies he had been telling for months, publicly and privately, including to the officials in the targeted states. And he knew they were not true. In Arizona, he claimed more than 36,000 ballots had been cast by non-citizens. Regarding Georgia, the defendant repeated the falsehood that more than 10,300 dead people voted. And he raised publicly disproving claims about fraud by election workers at State Farm Arena. He made baseless allegations of dead voters in Nevada and Michigan and false claims about illegally counted votes in Wisconsin. And in Pennsylvania, he claimed that there were hundreds of thousands more ballots counted than there had been voters. The defendant also lied to his rally supporters when he claimed that certain states wanted to reconsider or recertify their duly appointed electors. For instance, he said, quote, "By the way, Pennsylvania has now seen all of this. They didn't know because it was so quick. They had a vote. They counted. But now they see all this stuff. It's come to light. Doesn't happen that fast. And they want to recertify their votes. They want to recertify. But the only way that can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. Mike Pence has to agree to send it back," unquote. The overall impact of the defendant's speech, particularly in light of months of statements and tweets falsely claiming election fraud and following on the heels of CC1 and CC2 speeches, was to fuel the crowd's anger. For instance, when the defendant told his supporters that, quote, "We will not let them silence your voices. We're not going to let it happen," unquote, the crowd chanted, "Fight for Trump," in response. When the defendant, soon after he told supporters that, quote, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol," unquote, and that they would, quote, "never take back our country with weakness," and unquote, and that they had to, quote, "show strength and had to be strong," unquote. Members of the crowd shouted, "Invade the Capitol building," and "Take the Capitol." Thousands of the defendant's supporters obeyed his directives and marched to the Capitol, where the certification proceeding began around 1:00 p.m. Minutes earlier, Pence had issued a public statement explaining that his role as Senate president did not include unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not. On the floor of the House of Representatives, Pence opened the certificates of vote and the certificate of ascertainment from Arizona, consistent with the ECA. After an objection from a senator and a representative, the House and Senate retired to their separate chambers to debate it. Outside the Capitol building, a mass of people, including those who had traveled to Washington and the Capitol at the defendant's direction, broke through barriers cordoning off the Capitol building and advanced on the building. Among these was CC5, who had attended the defendant's speech from the Washington Monument, marched with the crowd to the Capitol, and breached the restricted area surrounding the building. A large portion of the crowd at the Capitol, including rioters who violently attacked law enforcement officers trying to secure the building, were clothed and carried items bearing the defendant's name and campaign slogans, leaving no doubt that they were there on his behalf and at his direction. Beginning at about 1:30 p.m., the defendant settled in on the dining room off the Oval Office. He spent the afternoon there reviewing Twitter on his phone, while the dining room television played Fox News' contemporaneous coverage of the events at the Capitol. At 2:13 p.m., the crowd at the Capitol broke into the building and forced the Senate to recess. Within minutes, staffers fled the Senate chamber, carrying the illegitimate electors' physical certificates of vote and certificates of ascertainment. Next to the Senate chamber, a group of rioters chased a U.S. Capitol police officer up a flight of stairs to within 40 feet of where Pence was sheltering with his family. As they did so, the rioters shouted at the officer in search of public records. And I'm quoting, "Where the fuck are they? Where the fuck they counting the votes at? Why are you protecting them? You're a fucking traitor." Unquote. On the other side of the Capitol, the House was forced also to recess. Fox News' coverage of the events at the Capitol included, at about 2:12 p.m., reports of the Capitol being on lockdown and showed video footage of large crowds within the restricted area surrounding the Capitol. Much of the crowd was wearing clothing and carrying flags, evidence to their allegiance to the defendant. At about 2:20 p.m., video of crowds at the Capitol lawn and on the Capitol lawn and West Terrace were shown alongside a chyron stating, "Certification vote paused as protests erupt on Capitol Hill." At 2:21 p.m., an on-the-street reporter interviewed an individual marching from the Ellipse to the Capitol who claimed to have come to Washington, quote, "because President Trump told us we had something big to look forward to, and I believed that Vice President Pence was going to certify the electoral votes or not certify them, but I guess that's changed, correct? And it's a very big disappointment. I think that there's several hundred thousand people here who are very disappointed, but I still believe President Trump has something else left," unquote. And at approximately 2:24 p.m., Fox News reported that a police officer may have been injured and that protesters had made their way inside the Capitol. At 2:24 p.m., Trump was alone in his dining room when he issued a tweet attacking Pence and fueling the ongoing riot. Quote, "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones in which they were asked to certify previously. USA demands the truth," unquote. That afternoon at the Capitol, a rioter used a bullhorn to read the defendant's tweet about the vice president aloud to the crowd trying to gain entry into the building. The defendant issued an incendiary tweet about Pence despite knowing, as he would later admit to in an interview in 2023, that his supporters listened to him like no one else. 1 minute later, at 2:25 p.m., the Secret Service was forced to evacuate Pence to a secure location. At the Capitol, throughout the afternoon, members of the crowd were chanting, quote, "Hang Mike Pence! Where is Pence? Bring him out! Traitor Pence!" unquote. Different ones, different sayings, but all of those being said. Several rioters in those chanting crowds wore hats and carried flags, evidencing their allegiance to the president. In the years since January 6th, the defendant has refused to take responsibility for putting Pence in danger, instead blaming Pence. On March 13, 2023, he said, quote, "Had Mike Pence sent the votes back to the legislatures, they would not have had a problem with January 6th, so in many ways you can blame him for January 6th. Had he sent them back to Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, the states, I believe, number one, you would have a different outcome. But I also believe you wouldn't have had Jan 6, as we call it," unquote. Rioters again, many bearing pro-Trump paraphernalia, indicating their allegiance breaching the Senate chamber, rifled through the papers on the senators' desks and stood on the dais where Pence had been presiding just minutes earlier. On the House side, rioters watched the police as they evacuated lawmakers from the House chamber, smashing glass windows surrounding a locked door that stood between them and the fleeing members and staffers. At least one rioter recorded video showing members being evacuated, while the growing crowd screamed at the Capitol police officers guarding the locked door to the House Speaker's lobby. Some of the worst violence of the day took place outside of the Capitol on the Lower West Terrace. the side of the building facing the ellipse where the defendant had given his speech. There, scaffolding, placed in anticipation of the January 20th inauguration, created a tunnel leading to a set of double glass doors into the center of the Capitol building. After rioters had forced their way onto restricted Capitol grounds and past the security barriers, including layers of snow fencing and bike racks, they attacked the law enforcement officers trying to protect the building with flagpoles, bear spray, stolen police riot shields, and other improvised weapons. Of his time defending the Capitol, one Metropolitan Police officer said the following, quote, "I feared for my life from the moment I got into that. We were walking into the crowd when the Capitol Police officer was leading us into the front line. And especially when I got sprayed in the middle of the crowd, at that point, honestly, I thought, this is it. Yeah, multiple times. You're getting pushed, kicked, People are throwing metal bats at you and all that stuff. I was like, yeah, this is fucking it." Unquote. The officer described that the rioters encountered at the Capitol, were wearing both tactical gear and Trump paraphernalia, and appeared to be acting out of pure, sheer anger. In the years after January 6th, the defendant has reiterated his support for and allegiance to the rioters who broke into the Capitol, calling them patriots and hostages, providing them financial assistance, and reminiscing about January 6th as a beautiful day. At a rally in Waco, Texas on March 25th, 2023, the defendant started a tradition he has repeated several times, opening an event with a song called "Justice for All," recorded by a group of charged and in many cases convicted January 6th offenders known as the January 6th Choir, and who, because of their dangerousness, are held at the District of Columbia jail. At the Waco rally of the January 6th Choir, the defendant said, Our people love these people. They love these people." The defendant has also stated that if reelected, he will pardon individuals convicted of crimes on January 6th. On the evening of January 6th, the defendant and CC1 attempted to exploit the violence and chaos at the Capitol by having CC1 call senators and attempt to get them to further delay the certification. At around 7 p.m., CC1 placed calls to 5 U.S. senators and 1 U.S. representative. CC6 attempted to confirm phone numbers for members of Congress, whom the defendant had directed CC1 to call. In a voicemail that CC1 intended for one senator, he or she said, quote, "I'm calling you because I want to discuss with you how they're trying to rush this hearing and how we need you, our Republican friends, to try to just slow it down so we can get the legislatures to get more information to you. And I know they're reconvening at 8 tonight, but the only strategy we can follow is to object to numerous states and raise issues so that we can get ourselves into tomorrow, ideally into the end of tomorrow." Unquote. He then asked the senator to object in every state and to give them an opportunity to get the legislatures who are very, very close to pulling their votes. This concession, that legislatures had not yet asked to review their slates, stood in contrast to CC1 and the defendant's lies at the ellipse that they had already had. Next, in a voicemail intended for another senator, CC1 told more lies. He falsely claimed that Pence's direction and decision not to use the defendant's fraudulent electors' certificates had been surprising, and that in light of the surprise, quote, "We could use a little time so that the state legislatures can prepare even more to come to you and say, please give this back to us for a while so we can fix it." Unquote. CC1 then repeatedly, knowingly spread false claims of election fraud, including that non-citizens had voted in Arizona, and after an outcome determinative number of underage voters had cast ballots in Georgia as well. Although the attack on the Capitol successfully delayed the certification for approximately 6 hours, the House and the Senate resumed the joint session at 11:35 p.m. But the conspirators were not done. Within 10 minutes, at 11:44 p.m., CC2, who earlier that day wrote to P58 that, quote, "The siege is because you and your boss did not do what was necessary," unquote, emailed P58 again and urged him to convince Pence to violate the law, writing the following: "I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation of the ECA and adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislatures to finish their investigations, as well as to show a full forensic audit of the massive amounts of illegal activity that has been done and occurred here." At 3:41 a.m. on January 7th, as President of the Senate, Pence announced the certification and certified results of the 2020 presidential election in favor of Biden. All right, this gets us to Section 2 and where my reading of this motion ends. In Section 2, Smith, prosecutor, explains the legal principles that govern immunity following the Supreme Court's decision. And in Section 3, which is about 80 pages, the special prosecutor applies the principles from Section 2 to the evidence outlined in Section 1, which is the section that I've read aloud in this series. And here, Smith argues that none of it is barred by immunity. And then the last thing is Section 4, the conclusion, and this is where the prosecution asks the court for an order that Trump is not immune for the conduct described in Section 1 and outlined thereafter, and must stand trial on the charges in the indictment. But as I've mentioned, this is where I end it. So with that, thank you for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time.